a number of you have suggested just various projects that we should try to give a shot. So what you're seeing right now on the table is a bunch of our different containers. They're old projects and we have empty containers for new projects that are coming up. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna take a look at updates on some of our existing projects. And then after that, we're gonna go into these other containers and the different ideas we have in store for them. So here we have planted Ecosphere 2.0. Now this is the one that we put the single red cherry shrimp in, and ultimately she did wind up getting named. Her name is Portobello. So she's still doing great. I see her running around the container all the time. I can definitely tell that she's well fed because she's partially transparent, so I can tell that there's processed foods waiting to be evacuated from her system. So she's definitely doing well. Some of the other things that are still going inside the tank too are the plants that are growing up and out of the water are still doing good. Some of the leaves are dying off and falling back into the water, but overall the plants are still doing good. The log has not produced any more mushrooms ever since putting the bowl on top of it, but that log does have a lot of moss growing on top of it since we put the bowl on it. So that's an interesting change. We do have a little bit of algae growing on the walls. It hasn't been too bad, just a little bit of a haze really more than anything. And the seal that I had initially made with Vaseline between the bowl and the jar, it's not holding up. A portion of it has actually wound up cracking, or not really cracking, but sliding down. So that's not gonna wind up working. So I'm gonna redo a different seal with silicone. I was hoping the Vaseline would work just because it gives me the option if something is going wrong in there to try to open it up and take this shrimp out just in case. But we might have to wind up going with a option that's not quite as easy to reverse. I could just take a razor blade and cut it, so I definitely could still open it up if need be. But overall, it is definitely doing good. We're gonna continue to watch it, and I still see a lot of the really small crustaceans swimming around in the water too, so I don't have any shortage of those either. Here's the sealed terrarium that we built. And overall, it's been doing pretty darn well. Now, we don't really have much standing water in the bottom of it, like we had originally planned to do, but after sealing it up, we continued to watch it and everything seemed to be going really well. The plants all seem to have the adequate amount of moisture. We don't really seem to be having any issues with excess moisture because we haven't had many mold outbreaks. Now we do see little spots here and there of mold, but we do also have springtails and dwarf white isopods in there. So I think that they're doing a great job in keeping that in check. A lot of the other plants have really just been thriving. The moss on the piece of wood that we had originally put in there has been growing almost straight up towards the top, as well as pretty much all the other moss that we put on the ground is also just growing way more than I ever expected. So a lot of it has gotten really tall, it's standing up really high. Every plant in there is doing great. We even had a plant in there that we put in. We knew what type of plant it was, but it had been destroyed by some crickets in a different container that we had. So it didn't have any leaves on it to begin with. But after putting it in the tank and after giving it a while, it is showing some new growth. All it was a stem when it started, and now it has not full-size leaves, but it's definitely starting to establish itself and get going. So that's really neat, and it's adding a nice difference in color to the tank because the leaves have a pink color on them. Overall, we are just really happy with how it's going. We're gonna continue to leave it sealed. It's been sealed for about 2 months now, and it's been doing great. So we're gonna just keep watching and see what happens. And now we have the amphipod. This is another ecosphere. This one, I think it's been about 2 months since we made it. Now, right after the 1 month update video, we did open it up and we had put in a few Amazon frog bit. They're just a floating plant that stays on the top. We were a little bit worried that there might be a little too much going on inside of here when it came to decaying matter, so we wanted to try to give another plant to kind of take up this excess stuff that's getting off or putting off into the water from all the leaves and stuff that are breaking down at the bottom. Now, on the 1 month update video, we did have almost like a cloudy layer that was right about halfway mark on the tank, and we were pretty sure it was a bacterial bloom. Now that bacterial bloom, we watched it slowly lower and lower and lower that cloudiness until at this point it's pretty much gone. Now, so the bacterial bloom seems to have gone away, but we also are seeing less numbers in our amphipod population. Now there's definitely is still amphipods going around, and we do still see them around, but we did notice that at first when we would bump the container or anything like that, we'd see quite a few of them just dart down from the top of the tank. Whereas if we do that now, we don't see quite the same number doing that same motion. The case carrying worms that are in here, there is a ton of them now. And we also have a lot of bladder snails as well. So the bladder snails, there have been like 1 or 2 in there that had laid eggs, and we had tried to get as many out as we could before we sealed it up. But we definitely didn't successfully do that. So there is a ton of bladder snails in here. They're starting to get larger. Their shells are really pretty, so or at least in my opinion, they're really interesting, partially like transparent and also shiny at the same time. So they're going back and forth, they're swimming up and down against the glass and stuff. It's really intriguing that they can swim at all. But overall, I wish that we hadn't seen the decline in the amphipod numbers, but we still do see quite a bit of life in there. The moss on the tip of the stick that's sticking out of the water is growing pretty well. And a lot of the plants that are in there seem to be doing okay as well. I do see the very small crustaceans still in here swimming around in the bottom. So not exactly sure which way this one is swinging, whether it's stabled out or stabilized itself, or if it's still going kind of through that equalizing process where it's trying to find its equilibrium. But there's still stuff alive in here, and it's been right around 2 months. Here we have an update from last week's video, our brine shrimp ecosphere, and a little bit of a moss experiment to see if we could get it to grow in salt water. So we'll start with the ecosphere. This ecosphere, the brine shrimp population in it is pretty much dead. We think at the beginning, some of the things that may have been done wrong is, or we might have overlooked, is the chaetomorpha, the algae, the macroalgae we put in here, does a really good job of uptaking nutrients from the water. So downside to that, if there is a huge quantity of it in there, any nutrients that the microalgae needs to grow may not be able to be taken up and allow that population of microalgae to thrive because there's just so much of the chaetomorpha. So because of that, it might have outcompeted the smaller stuff that the brine shrimp need in order to use for food because they're filter feeders. So we effectively might have accidentally removed a food source by putting so much of it in there. So in retrospect, next time if we try it again, if we use chaetomorpha, we're probably going to use less of it. Because the brine shrimp did die off. They died off. Now, the thing is, we do have a ton more eggs, so we definitely can keep trying the experiment, but the other half of this particular sample from the hatchery is still alive in the hatchery itself. So we know it's because of this container and the setup, and not because the brine shrimp themselves had any other issues or things like that. So this particular setup is not going to keep brine shrimp alive, at least not in the way we executed it. Maybe done a little bit differently would have better chances. We're going to definitely revisit that and try to maybe tweak it a little bit and give it a better chance. Now when it comes to the growing terrestrial moss that I found out on growing on the ground in salt water, did that work or did it not? In the time lapse, I didn't see any definitive growth. I did see a lot of air bubbles in the first few days in particular. The time lapse is about 1 week long. In the first couple days, there was a lot of bubbles. So what I think was happening there is that it was actually doing photosynthesis and producing oxygen. But then it definitely tapered off and I started seeing yellowing in the moss. The one thing I'm not sure about is the way I had the time lapse set up, it was constantly exposed to light. And the thing is, if it's constantly exposed to light and going through photosynthesis, it's going to use up all the carbon dioxide in the water to the point where there's no more. And if there's no more, it can't continue to do photosynthesis. It needs the carbon dioxide to do it. So I might take this moss and put it underneath an alternating light schedule or cycle to see if it still continues to grow that way. I did see some yellowing, but I did also see the pearling from the oxygen, so I'm not quite sure which way I feel about this particular moss in salt water. So I'm going to set it up in a different environment, give it some nighttime, because when it's dark, the moss itself does use oxygen, so it will be producing CO2 during those dark periods of time. I also might try to put a fan or something to circulate air into the container and allow some CO2 to be dissolved into the water. Now we're on to the fun part, or at least the fun part that we haven't made anything from yet. So these are a couple of different things that we have for different projects that are up and coming, but we maybe haven't decided on them yet, or just It really depends depending on the container. So I'm gonna talk about each one individually. First is this one right here. This one, it has a small kind of a sphere container on top. We're gonna wind up putting a small plant there, but ultimately, the bottom portion of this, it has a piece of driftwood that we've been soaking for a couple weeks now that's finally actually sinking. So in the bottom of here, we want to make an ecosphere. It's going to be an ecosphere we're going to set up, and it's going to be a little bit of a longer process because we're going to use what's called a dry start method. We'll go into that more of that later, but we're going to have an ecosphere in the bottom, and we're probably going to have a plant up top. We're not sure if we want to do maybe a succulent up top or something that kind of vines down over the top of the container itself. And then we have this container over here. While we were out shopping, we had the people in our Discord kind of vote on the different containers we had found at the store, which one they liked the most. And this is the one that wound up choosing. We really like this container too. It has a great seal on it with this rubber gasket. It has these metal clips that holds us down really tight. And it also has a glass top, so light can still get in through the top. So that's good for plants and things of that nature. We haven't exactly decided what we're gonna do in it yet, but we're pretty excited to actually use this container itself. And last but not least, in the background, we have a 10-gallon aquarium. We actually have two. One of them's not in shot, but I didn't think we needed two of identical containers on the table. So these 10-gallon aquariums, we want to do an event, a live event really, for our 10,000 subscriber kind of milestone and a celebration for it. So we're trying to get some ideas going and some plans set in place. That way, once we cross that threshold, we can do something live while we're making these, or using both of these 10-gallon aquariums. We also want to use this deer skull right here. Now, the deer skull, it did die of natural causes, so don't worry about that. We're not sure what we want to do with it yet. We've had a couple of different ideas, ranging from maybe trying to grow moss on the deer skull itself, or seeing if we get plants to grow up and through it, or maybe even putting it into an aquatic setting, so that way the different inhabitants inside of it can use it kind of as a cave. So we're kind of undecided on that. If you have any ideas on any of these containers or any suggestions, definitely feel free to leave them in the comments below. A lot of them are works in progress that we're kind of hashing out the ideas on, so we're not set in stone on exactly what we're going to do or how we're going to go about it. So we'd love to hear your ideas, and hopefully you guys enjoy these projects that are up and coming just as much as the ones we've already made.